Good evening, everybody. Well, today we're going to be continuing in 2 Peter. We'll be in chapter 2 today. Now, the objectives in studying this chapter are to examine Peter's detailed description of false teachers, be aware of their techniques in leading others astray, and their sad end, and to ascertain whether or not these false teachers had ever been true Christians. Now, the summary of the chapter is as follows. One of the themes of Peter's second epistle is beware of false teachers, and such is the focus of the second chapter. Just as there were false teachers and prophets in the Old Testament, so there would be false teachers in our times. Peter first describes the destructiveness of false teachers. Denying the Lord who brought them, they will secretly introduce destructive heresies. Many will follow them, and the way of truth will be blasphemed, but they will bring swift destruction on themselves. Now, illustrating the doom of the false teachers, Peter reminds us of his readers of what happened to the angels who sinned, and the ancient world that was destroyed by the flood, and the fiery end of Sodom and Gomorrah. Surely God knows how to reserve the wicked for the day of judgment, and the example of Lot shows that he also knows how to deliver the godly out of temptation. Peter then discusses the depravity of false teachers. In arrogance they revile against authority, all while reveling in pleasure and lusts as they circulate among the Christians they seek to influence. Like the prophet Balaam, they are motivated by the wages of unrighteousness and have forsaken the right way. Empty of true substance, they are like wells without water, or clouds tossed about by a tempest. Finally, Peter describes the deceptions of the false teachers. In both their methods and promises, they seek to deceive those who, like them, had once escaped the pollutions of the world. But the false teachers are once again enslaved by such pollutions, and their last end is worse than the beginning. Now, we'll start with an outline of the chapter, beginning with the first verse. And the first three verses talk about the destructiveness of false teachers. Just as there were false prophets, there are also false teachers. They will bring into destruction heresies, even denying the Lord who brought them. Many will follow their destructive ways, and the truth will be blasphemed. And then it talks about their destructive methods. They'll bring about their heresies secretly. They will exploit through covetousness and deceitful words. And their destructive end, they will bring swift destruction on themselves. Their judgment is not idle. Their destruction does not slumber. Then verses 4 through 9, the doom of the false teachers, the example of angels who sin. God did not spare the angels who sinned. He cast them down to hell, Tartarus, delivered them to chains of darkness reserved for judgment. And then the example of the flood. God did not spare the ancient world, bringing the flood on the ungodly. He saved Noah and his family of 8, a preacher of righteousness. And then the example of Sodom and Gomorrah. He turned the cities into ashes, condemning them to destruction. He made them an example to those who would live ungodly. He delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked, who was tormented daily by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. God will deliver the godly and punish the unjust. The Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations. He will reserve the unjust under punishment for the day of judgment. Now, verses 10 through 17 talks about the depravity of the false teachers. Reveling against authority, they walk according to the flesh in the lust of uncleanness. They despise authority, are presumptuous, self-willed. They're not afraid to speak evil of dignitaries, unlike angels, who are greater in power and might, who do not bring reveling accusations before the Lord. They are like wonderful natural brute beasts, made to be caught and destroyed, speaking of evil of things that they do not understand, who will utterly perish in their own corruption, who receive the wages of unrighteousness. Starting in verse 13 through 14, it talks about the reveling with great pleasure. They count it pleasure to carouse in the daytime. Spots and blemishes, they carouse in their own deceptions while feasting with Christians. Yet they have eyes full of adultery, they cannot cease from sin, beguiling unstable souls. They have hearts trained in covetous practices and are accursed children. They are revolting against the right way. They have forsaken the right way and have gone astray. Like Balaam, they love the wages of unrighteousness, who was rebuked for his iniquity. His madness restrained by donkeys speaking with a man's voice. They are like wells without water, clouds carried by a tempest. For those the gloom of darkness is reserved forever. And then 18 through 22 talks about the deceptions of the false teachers. They're deceptive in their methods. They speak great swelling words with emptiness. They allure those who have escaped through the lust of the flesh, through licentiousness. Deceptions in their promises, verse 19. They promise liberty while they themselves are slaves of corruption. For whom a person is overcome, by him also he is brought into bondage. Whose latter end is worse than the beginning. This is 20 through 22. Having become entangled and overcome by the pollutions of the world, which they have escaped through the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. It would have been better not to have known the way of righteousness than having known it, and to turn from the holy commandment delivered to them. It has happened to them according to the proverb. A dog returns to his own vomit, a sow having washed to her wallowing in the mire. Okay, that's the outline of the chapter. So now let's look at some of the questions and answers for this. So what are the main points of the chapter? The destructiveness of false teachers, the doom of false teachers, the depravity of false teachers, and the deceptions of false teachers. What does Peter warn that false teachers will do? He warns they will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the Lord who brought them. What impact will such false teachers have? Their impact is many will follow their destructive ways. The way of truth will be blasphemed. So how will teachers exploit people? By covetousness and with deceptive words. What three examples does Peter use to illustrate the doom of false teachers? The examples are the angels who sinned or cast into hell, the ancient world destroyed by the flood, and the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah turned into ashes. How was Lot oppressed by living in Sodom? By every day seeing and hearing the filthy conduct of the wicked. What two things does the Lord know to do? He knows how to deliver the ungodly out of temptations and how to reserve the unjust under punishment for the day of judgment. Who in particular will receive such judgment? Those who walk in uncleanness and despise authority, those who are presumptuous and self-willed, not afraid to speak evil of dignitaries. What are angels unwilling to do? And that's verse 11. Bring reveling accusations against dignitaries before the Lord. How does Peter further describe the false teachers? And this is 12 through 14. They speak evil of things they do not understand. They count it pleasure to carouse in the daytime. They have eyes full of adultery, beguiling unstable souls. They have hearts trained in covetousness and accursed children. In whose way have such teachers followed? And this is verses 15 and 16. And he said, it is Balaam who loved the wages of righteousness and was rebuked by a donkey. How else does Peter describe these false teachers? as wells without water and clouds carried by a tempest, for whom the gloom of darkness is reserved. How are the false teachers able to allure others? This is verse 18. By speaking great swelling words of emptiness, and through the lusts of the flesh and licentiousness. So, who will they seek to allure? Those who have escaped from those living in error. And promising others liberty, what are they themselves and why? Well, they're slaves of corruption, and they're slaves because for whom a person is overcome, by him he is also brought into bondage. What have these false teachers once escaped, and how? Well, they once escaped the pollutions of the world through the knowledge of Jesus Christ. What then happened again to them? What again happened to them? They were again entangled in the pollutions of the world and were overcome. How had their latter end become worse for them than the beginning? This is 20 and 21. It says it would have been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than knowing it, to then turn from the holy commandment. What twofold proverb does Peter use to describe their sorry condition? The proverb that refers to a dog returning to his vomit and a sow having washed to the wallowing in the mire. So, what in this chapter reveals that these false teachers had once been saved? And several verses, 1, 15, 20, 21, and 22. And it talks about the fact that the Lord had bought them. They had forsaken the right way, so they knew of the right way. They had escaped the pollutions of the world through the knowledge of Jesus. They had known the way of righteousness, and like a sow, they had been washed. So that's the lesson for today. It's 2 Peter chapter 2. I hope you've enjoyed it, and think about how we can apply it to the world today, because if you look around, a lot of these conditions that he was talking about with these false teachers are exactly the things we're facing today. So we'll continue next week with chapter 3. Thank you very much for your attention. Have a good evening.